I think it's fair to say that the character of Kenpachi Zaraki received more than his fair share of development during the 1,000-year Blood War arc of Bleach. However, while Kenpachi's development mostly resulted in him receiving a couple of awesome-looking power-ups, there is one character who was so directly affected by that development that she up and disappeared from the series entirely. That character is, of course, Kenpachi's former vice-captain, the former vice-captain of the 11th Division, Yachiru Kusajishi. In something of a surprising subplot for Bleach's final arc, Yachiru quite literally disappears about halfway through the story, leaving behind nothing but a Shihaku show in a way very reminiscent of Aizen's hollow-fired experiments in the Turn Back the Pendulum mini-arc. Yachiru's disappearance is a plotline that is revisited numerous times during the 1,000-year Blood War arc, with Kenpachi often trying to find her and at one point almost stalling the trip to the Royal Palace because he was desperate to go out and continue the search. And then eventually she reappears right towards the end of the series to drop the major bombshell that Kenpachi is able to use Bankai. But Yachiru's disappearance is fascinating to fans because it's never been explicitly stated what actually happens to her, although I do believe the clues are there in the story to make it fairly clear as to her fate. However, because it is never explicitly stated in this video, we're going to be taking a look at Yachiru's surprising disappearance in 1,000-year Blood War arc, trying to take a look at the clues, at the fan theories, and come up with an explanation that we're happy with. Before you begin, however, guys, if you haven't hit subscribe yet, make sure to do so, as you are in the perfect place for Bleach content just like this every single week. So if you're a fan of Bleach, you're in the perfect place. Don't forget to give the video a like as well if you enjoyed it, because it really does help get the exposure on YouTube. And also don't forget to hit the notification bell to stay up to date with all of my videos. So before we dive into focusing on her disappearance, I think we should just do a very quick overview of Yachiru's role in the 1,000-year Blood War arc to set the stage and give us some context. And don't worry, it's not a particularly big role. She first appears quite early on in the Vice-Captain's meeting, where she mentions about how Ikkaku and Yumichika were investigating the disappearances in Rukongai. A little bit later on, after the Quincy's first invasion, Yachiru and Isane visit their respective captains' barracks as Kenpachi and Unohana duke it out in Muken far below the Soul Society. We get a really nice moment where Yachiru picks up Kenpachi's eye patch and obviously realises what's going on beneath them. She then appears a bit later on during the second invasion of the Quincy, where she helps Isane set up a makeshift infirmary, stealing some Quincy beds from their buildings nearby, which I always thought was quite funny, and then they get attacked by the Sturmritter Gwenael Lee. Yachiru actually reveals her Shikai at this point, Sanpo Kenju, which she uses to fight and overpower Gwenael. However, it's revealed that Gwenael is but a figment of the real Sturmritter's imagination, Gremmy Thamo. Gremmy then turns Yachiru's bones into cookies as she tries to attack him, and she lies defeated until Kenpachi himself arrives. Now the true Kenpachi having killed Unohana, he leaves Yachiru and faces Gremmy himself on a grand stage. The next time we see her is a rather mysterious segment when Kenpachi flies towards a meteorite and activates his Zanpakuto for the very first time on screen with Drink Nozarashi. And we see Yachiru looking up at him as he says the name, a flashback to her first meeting with him back in the Rukon districts. And then after that, the next time we see her, she is gone. Kenpachi finishes his fight with Gremmy and finds her Shihakusho lying on the ground and immediately initiates a search for her, as this is obviously rather unusual even for Yachiru. Kenpachi's search for Yachiru, like I said, carries on throughout the rest of the arc. When they're trying to go to the Royal Palace, he demands they stop and look for her, but Nanao is able to change his mind. When they get to the actual Varvelt Palace itself and the fight with Gerard Valkyrie is underway, Kenpachi is pretty quickly overwhelmed by Gerard and is then visited by Yachiru, who appears to come out of nowhere as though she's some kind of apparition. Yachiru then helps Kenpachi gain an awesome new power-up, giving him the ability to use Bankai, and he then takes on Gerard with much more ease. However, she makes him use too much of his strength, his arm is ruined, and then he is taken out of the fight. And we never see Yachiru again. Kenpachi, however, in the penultimate chapter of the series does mention that she is not around anymore. And that's basically it for the vice captain of the 11th Division in the Thousand Year Blood War arc. By the epilogue of the series, Ikkaku is named vice captain in her place, and Kenpachi seems to have made peace with the fact that she is gone. But what actually happened to her, what triggered her disappearing, and what actually is Yachiru? The most common theory, and the one I have always subscribed to, is that Yachiru is actually the physical embodiment of Kenpachi's Zanpakuto, Nozarashi. She is Nozarashi's Zanpakuto's spirit. And if you go back and look at my reviews, my weekly reviews, you'll see that's exactly what I thought when I was reading the manga as well. It seems to make by far the most sense to me. Now, none of this really makes complete sense without a few caveats, and that's the sort of thing we'll get into in a minute, but I want to look at this main theory of Yachiru being Nozarashi's spirit in a bit more detail. Now, there's definitely evidence to suggest that this is actually the case, but the majority of it does appear in the Thousand Year Blood War arc, specifically from the second invasion onwards. You could point to their very first meeting back when Yachiru first arrives on the scene in the dangerous Rukon district. She somehow managed to survive in this horrible, lawless place despite being essentially a tiny child. And when she first meets Kenpachi, she touches his Zanpakuto, like almost laughs at the blood on her fingers. And I think that you could, in retrospect, see that as her, touching the blade. She and it are one, but I think that's more Kubo getting lucky with some of his past decisions than anything else. The majority of the evidence to support it happens in the second invasion and onwards. The first major piece of evidence we get is a bit of a weird one, and initially it raised a few red flags as to the true nature of her being, but nothing necessarily too out of the ordinary. When she takes on Gwenael Lee, she activates her Zanpakuto's Shikai for the first time, Sanpo Kenju, or at least it appears to be a Shikai. However, Kubo makes a point of showing Isane not quite understanding what this actually is that she is looking at. Yachiru's so-called Shikai summons two creatures to stand either side of her, each with their own blades, and essentially that is the power of her Zanpakuto. She swings, they do the same thing as her. She essentially has three swords in one. As Isane points out, however, Sanpo Kenju is like no Shikai she has ever seen before. It's not like Captain Unohana's that materialized itself into an actual physical being, and it's not like Hitsugaya's either, where a being was materialized from a substance that emerged from the Zanpakuto. These creatures appear to be two almost totally autonomous beings that just exist within her sword, but the blade itself has changed in absolutely no way. It also appears that she doesn't use a release command for Sanpo Kenju. She says come on out, but I don't believe that's actually supposed to be the release command. I want to get into the debate as to what this actually means for her character if this isn't actually a Shikai in a minute, but for now this is the first piece of indication we get that maybe something is not quite right with Yachiru. Obviously, the next major one is that her spiritual body just completely vanishes in a way that is similar to the victims of Aizen's experiments in the Turn Back the Pendulum arc, leaving behind nothing but their clothes, which implies the spiritual body itself has broken down and vanished entirely. This seems to happen just after Kenpachi says the name Nozarashi and activates his Zanpakuto, implying now that he actually knows the name of his Zanpakuto, he's communicated with his spirit, Yachiru can finally disappear. Again, this is kind of weird and presents its own problems, but we'll get into that in a minute. And the final piece of evidence, and the absolute most concrete one, in my opinion, that is nearly irrefutable, is Yachiru's out-of-nowhere appearance during the battle with Gerard. So Kenpachi has been beaten to a pulp by this godlike Quincy, and he's lying near death on the floor, and Yachiru appears out of nowhere in front of him, asking him what he's doing lying on the ground. Now, this could initially be attributed to Kenpachi just seeing her in front of him in like a dreamlike, dazed state after the beating he's taken, and he even says to her, "Where have you been all this time?" Kind of, you might imagine this is what he wants to see right now. However, Yachiru actually leans down and tries to lift him up again, and she implores with him to keep fighting. In fact, in the English Viz translation, she explicitly says, "Let's keep going, let's keep fighting," implying it's both of them she's talking about. She then also says, "If you use me properly, there is nothing, no one you can't cut." again, use me properly, pretty clearly implying that she is calling herself as Zanpakuto. But the biggest point and the final nail in the coffin, as far as I'm concerned, is right at the end of this scene when she gives Kenpachi the power to activate Bankai, and she turns to almost face the reader and she says this power is called Bankai, and you see that Kubo has explicitly drawn the shine in the shape of Nozarashi's sealed state in her eyes. I don't think Kubo would have drawn the blade in her eyes if it wasn't supposed to indicate that this is her true nature, her true form, that she is the spirit of his Zanpakuto in some form or another, and she gives him the power to use Bankai. And even later on, when his arm snaps, she says that she released too much of his strength at one time, implying that she is controlling his power to some degree. So yeah, particularly with that final scene, it really does seem like Yachiru is the embodiment of Nozarashi. But there are a couple of counterpoints I would like to bring up, because this is definitely a little bit weird, and I'm not entirely sure it works either way. Whether you want to say she is or she isn't, I think there's definitely questions on either side. So the first thing I want to bring up is the fact that she is a member of the Gotei 13 at all. She wears a Shihaku Sho, she has a Zanpakuto of some kind, and she is a member of the Gotei 13. Now that's already pretty weird. How did she get through the Shinigami Academy? We know that she wasn't a Shinigami initially because she meets Kenpachi in the Rukongai, so the two of them would have had to have gone into the Gotei 13 themselves, and you can presume there's no evidence to suggest otherwise that Yachiru had to go through the Shino Academy just like everybody else. Maybe the fact that she came in with Kenpachi and he outright kills Kenpachi Giganjo for the captain position means that she was able to just usurp the position of vice captain. That's possible, but there is also the notion that if she did go through the academy, surely somebody picked up on the fact that something's not quite right here. Then there's Sanpo Kenju, her supposed Zanpakuto. If it's not a real Shikai, what is it? Is it actually just an Asauchi that she's carrying around for show to try and give the idea that she's a Shinigami? What I think's possible is that the two autonomous creatures that she has summoned are actually just an excess of Kenpachi's spiritual pressure, creatures that she has created of her own accord, basically from the overflowing amount of power she actually has. There's no Shikai here. She's just created these creatures to kind of act as a Shikai while she swings an empty blade. The problem with that is, doesn't Oetsu Nimaya know the location of just about every Asauchi in the series? He knows all the wielders and everything like that. He even knows when Kenpachi himself picks up someone else's Zanpakuto to use for himself and imprint his own spirit onto it. So that's a weird situation. Does Oetsu know of Yachiru's true nature and he's just overlooking it, or is something else going on here? Another potential issue, and one thing that I am very curious to see how the anime in particular handles, is once Kenpachi kills Unohana in Muken, Nozarashi actually starts speaking to him for the first time ever. At first, Kenpachi has no idea who's talking. He thinks that someone else is in Muken calling him out, and it's only right at the end that he realises it's actually his sword speaking to him. This implies to me that he can't recognise the voice that is talking to him, so clearly it doesn't sound like Yachiru. So is the anime going to make it Yachiru's voice and we're just going to have to assume that he doesn't realise it's her, or are they going to make Nozarashi sound completely different? That's something I think I'm actually quite interested to see. Then, of course, there comes the question of the fact that if Yachiru is the externalization of Kenpachi's Zanpakuto spirit, how can Nozarashi talk to him in Muken if she's still in the 11th Division barracks? That also goes double for the fact that she still exists after Kenpachi presumably learns his Shikai. Unless you're telling me that the very first time he activates Nozarashi is when he destroys the meteorite, but that seems very unlikely to me. I'd be very surprised if he didn't activate it at some point in Muken once finding out how. But then that doesn't explain why Yachiru is still around. As you can see, there are definitely clear issues on both sides. However, I think Kubo gives enough evidence to suggest that she is in fact Kenpachi's Zanpakuto spirit. To me, that has always seemed like the most logical and the most obvious answer as to her true nature. There are some other explanations for her disappearance, however. I have seen some people comparing Kenpachi and Yachiru to Stark and Lilanet, and while similar, I don't think they are the same thing. thing. Stark and Lilinet used to be one being, literally one being, who had to split themselves in two because of their colossal and overwhelming power. And while I don't deny that Kenpachi probably has as much, if not more, power than that, I don't think it works in the same way, and I also think the fact that Yachiru mentions using her and has the blade in her eyes is far more conducive with her actually being his Zanpakuto spirit than an entirely separate being. If she was an entirely separate, almost second half of Kenpachi, why would she disappear when he activates his Shikai? Another interesting take I've heard is that Yachiru is not just the spirit of Nozarashi, but actually the Bankai spirit of Nozarashi. That's in the fact that she's able to give Kenpachi Bankai during the Gerard fight, and also, as Isane mentions, normally if a Zanpakuto spirit can be seen, it's the externalization of that spirit due to the Bankai training a Shinigami undergoes, which is to say, when a Shinigami tries to learn Bankai, they force out their Zanpakuto spirit and they force it to submit to them. Now, I kind of like this theory, but again, I just don't think it's right. I think it makes more sense that she is Nozarashi itself. Otherwise, again, why would she disappear just because he activates his Shikai? Why would she not disappear much later on and then he activates Bankai? And again, I think the clues are to be found in the fight with Gerard. She just sounds like she's talking about herself as a Zanpakuto overall. Another interesting question is, if she is Kenpachi's Zanpakuto spirit, why has she materialized like this at all? Is it down to Kenpachi having an enormous spiritual pressure, or is it maybe something else? Kenpachi perhaps wasn't listening to his Zanpakuto spirit at all, so she materialized in a way that he would. And the two of them have an incredibly close bond, which is why I was always able to accept him automatically knowing how to use Bankai, because they have almost a closer bond than any Shinigami has ever had with their Zanpakuto. Kenpachi looks after her like she's family. Although, yeah, he doesn't know that she's his Zanpakuto spirit, they do have such an incredibly tight bond that it makes total sense to me that he would already know how to use Bankai, she would just have to give it to him. But regardless, I think that is that. From their first meeting in the Rukon district to when she touches the metal of the blade, perhaps signifying that she is in fact that Zanpakuto, she's almost trying to tell him this. Right the way through to the 1,000-Year Blood War arc, when she reveals her almost fake Shikai, and then Kenpachi activates Nozarashi and she realizes he's finally able to hear her properly, so she disappears and becomes one with the blade he is actually holding. And then eventually she gives him the power to use Bankai in the most dangerous of situations and openly says to him, you need to use me properly and then you can cut anybody. It is a weird situation, there is literally nothing else like it in the series. I really enjoyed the subplot in the 1,000-Year Blood War arc. Yachiru's disappearance added another layer of mystery to the story that I really wasn't expecting to get out of these two. And like I said, I think overall it makes sense. There are some things that I find difficult to explain away, like the fact that Nozarashi is talking to Kenpachi, but Yachiru is actually also still around. All those kind of things are a bit weird. And there are also kind of the moments in Soul Society arc as well, when Kenpachi is defeated by Ichigo, and he is lying on the ground, destitute, holding his blade above his face, and just kind of being like, why won't you speak to me? And Yachiru is standing right next to him, if I remember rightly, so that's also a little bit weird. Not to mention Yachiru's cat-shaped Reiatsu that she uses against the messenger in the Soul Society arc as well. That doesn't seem to have any relevance anymore. These are all ideas that Kubo could have quite easily been building on a little bit in the Soul Society arc and then just thrown it all away to go with the idea of her being his Zanpakuto spirit. That's kind of what I think happened here. And I like it because it adds a new dynamic to their relationship and it really strengthens their bond. And it makes her as well of real value and use to Kenpachi, which I think adds a little bit more to Yachiru's character. This is a mystery that I wonder if they'll bother elaborating on in the anime, but really I don't think they necessarily need to. I think it is pretty clear-cut that she's his Zanpakuto spirit. There's just all these other mitigating circumstances to consider. But that's it for this video, guys. I hope maybe it helped clear things up if you weren't sure about Yachiru. It is never explicitly stated, but I think that kind of makes it all the more interesting regardless. But let me know in the comments below what you thought of Yachiru's story in the Thousand Year Blood War arc, and what you thought of her disappearance subplot as well. And basically, the question of the video is, do you think she is Nozarashi, or is she something else? Do let me know in the comments below. But until next time, guys, make sure to hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you then. Goodbye.